今日はあえて私の下手な語りと英語のストーリーテリングの違いということで今回試みちょっとさせてもらいました。違いが楽しんでいただけたらと思っています。
日本の話と、世界を旅してきましたが、また今度はスキンフリンクというちょっとまた楽しい話ですので、ごゆっくり楽しんでください。
This is another story from Russia. The first story, Fish in the Forest, was from Russia. I'm enjoying Russian stories at the moment. And it's also about a merchant, a very different merchant. In the time of the Tsars, there was a merchant named Marko. And Marko was very well to do, very successful in business. He liked to think of himself as Marko the Rich. But everyone who knew him called him Marko the Skinflint. Do you know what a skinflint is? It's someone who is mean. Now, Marko was so mean that he had his wife sew up the pockets in every single garment, just in case he accidentally put money in them and spent it while he was outside. He was so mean that if his grandmother came to stay, he'd charge her rent. He was so, well, I'll show you just how mean he was. One day, Marko was strolling in his fine garment through the marketplace. And there, in the gutter, filthy and dressed in rags, was a beggar. Alms, alms, oh ye Orthodox, alms for the love of God. And Marko, being Marko, walked straight past. Now, coming just behind Marko was a peasant, a mujik. Not a rich man, indeed a poor man. But not so poor that he didn't stop and give a penny or two, a kopeck, to the poor beggar. Praise be the Lord. Thank you. Now Marko, although he was mean, did not like being shown up in this way. So he turned and he said to the peasant, my good man, I too have a mind to give this poor beggar some money, but I have no small change about me at the moment. Could you possibly lend me a kopeck that I can give the beggar? And the peasant said, yes, and handed over a kopeck. And Marko took the small coin and proffered it graciously to the beggar, who was suitably grateful. And Marko went to make his way out of the mud. But the peasant thought, just a minute, when will I get my kopeck back? And he tugged on the sleeve of Marko and said, excuse me, how will I get my kopeck back? And Marko said, oh, that's very easy. I am Marko the Rich. Oh dear, thought the peasant, Marko the Skinflint. I am Marko the Rich, everybody knows where I live. Just come to my house tomorrow and it's a small matter, we'll deal with it then. So the next day, the peasant knocked at the door of Marko's house. And Marko's wife let him in to the study. And Marko was standing there and the peasant said, I've come for my kopeck. And Marko went, I'm terribly sorry, I don't seem to have any small change about me at all. Could you come back tomorrow? And the peasant said, well, I suppose so. And off he went. The very next day, the peasant was back knocking at the door, and Marko's wife let him in. Come, you've come about the kopeck, I suppose. Yes, come to me. He took him in the study, and there, a very fine desk, rather like this, a great bureau. And he opened a drawer, and he pulled out a 1,000 ruble note. Do you have change for 1,000? No? Oh, I'm so sorry. And the peasant said, well, what am I to do? And he said, well, these things take a little while. Come back in a fortnight, and I'm sure by then I'll have some small change. So the peasant went away. The days ticked by. 2 weeks came and went. Marco and his wife are at home, and there's a knock at the door. And Marco, who had forgotten, suddenly remembered. 2 weeks, it'll be that peasant for his kopeck. What can I do? Wife, I am going to strip myself naked, and I will lie down here under the icons and the holy pictures. And when you let the peasant in, you must tell him that I died this morning. And his wife looked at him. All right. So Marco stripped off every item of clothing and stark naked. He lay down very still under the icons and the holy paintings, and Marco's wife opened the door to the peasant. Oh, whoa, oh, whoa, my husband died this morning, as you can see. And the peasant came in anyway. I'm sorry to trouble you in a time of trouble, he said, but I've come out the camp thinking, oh, I don't know what to do. Well, she said, as you can see, my poor husband is laid out and he died this morning. And the peasant said, well, I feel I should do something to help you in your hour of need. Perhaps I could wash the body. Would you get some hot water and a stiff scrubbing brush, and I will clean the body and prepare it for the film. It's the least I can do. Well, the wife had no choice. Meanwhile, Marco's the wife has the servant fetch a big pot of hot water and a scrubbing brush, and when the hot water comes, the peasant goes, ooh, a bit warmer, I think. Well, 3 times it went back to the kitchen for hotter water until finally, ooh, just right. And the peasant took a pot of water and the scrubbing brush over to where Marco lay, and scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed and scrubbed. And Marco's going, not making a noise, and he scrubbed and scrubbed until he'd used up a whole scrubbing brush and 3 buckets of water, and Marco was pink, red raw, glistening. And the peasant said, you know, there's still more I think I can do to help. I feel I should read psalms over the body. Of course, we must do this in church. Would you have a coffin fetched? A coffin? What? Yes. And so Marco's wife sent the servants to fetch a coffin. And Marco was laid stark naked in the coffin, and the coffin was carried to church, followed by the peasant. The coffin was laid in front of the altar, and the peasant took the good book, and he began to read the holy psalms. And he read. And he read. And he read. And he read for hour after hour after hour, until it was night time outside. And Marco and the peasant were left alone in the church with just a few candles for light. And still he read. And suddenly there was a great crash, and the doors of the church flew open, and in came a band of thieves and robbers. The peasant hid behind a pillar to see what should happen. Marco lay very still. Well, the thieves and robbers had been out thieving and robbing all day, and they were laden down with booty, gold and silver and pictures and jewellery and money. And they began then and there to share out the spoils. Some for you, some for you, some for you, some for you, some for me, some for you, some for you, some for you, some for you, some for me. Round and round and round they went until each and every item was fairly distributed, except one. They could not decide who should have it. It was a very fine sabre, a sword, in a golden scabbard. They began to argue. In fact, they all laid hands on it together and began to tussle over it. Now this is when the peasant saw his moment. He stepped out from behind the pillar and said, "Stop!" Well, the thieves were startled, but they stopped their tussling and they looked up. And the peasant said, "You don't want to go on fighting over this, do you?" "Well, no." "Well, I can tell you how to settle it. It's very easy." And the thief said, "Well, tell us. And the peasant said, "It's very simple. The sword should go to whichever one of you thieves and robbers cuts off the head of this corpse." At which point Marco sits up. Ah! At which point the thieves drop the sword. Ah! say you and I share this between us, he said to the peasant. The peasant thought, not such a bad idea. Some for you, some for me, some for you, some for me. Until everything was distributed between them. And that might have been that. Except at the last moment, as they were about to leave, the peasant held out his hand to Marco and said, my kopeck? And Marco, who was standing there stark naked, said, well, as you can see, I have no small change about me. So I'm afraid that the peasant, whose name has not come down to history, never did get his kopeck. And Marco, who would so love to have been remembered as Marco the Rich, is known to this day as Marco the Skinflint.
ではここで5分ほどお休みをいただきまして、また2部に入りたいと思います。